There is a deeply embedded assumption that shapes how global politics is commonly understood, even among those who follow international affairs closely, and it is the belief that power at the highest level operates in a stable, centralized, and ultimately controllable way, where one dominant actor is able to set the direction of the system, while others, to varying degrees, respond within that framework. For several decades, this assumption has been closely associated with the position of the United States, which, particularly after the end of the Cold War, occupied a role that appeared not only dominant in terms of military and economic capability, but also structurally central to the organization of global institutions, alliances, and norms that defined how international interactions were conducted. This perception was reinforced by the consistency with which the United States was able to influence outcomes across different regions, whether through formal alliances, economic leverage, or strategic intervention, creating the impression that global order, while complex, ultimately revolved around a relatively stable center of decision-making and authority. However, if we examine this more carefully, it becomes apparent that this form of control was never solely the result of raw power, but rather depended on a particular alignment of conditions, including a high degree of institutional cohesion, limited competition from alternative systems, and a general acceptance, whether explicit or implicit, of the rules that underpinned the existing order. What this suggests is that control, in the way it has often been understood, is less about the absolute strength of a single actor and more about the degree to which the surrounding system remains organized in a way that allows that actor's influence to operate effectively and predictably across multiple domains. Over time, however, these underlying conditions have begun to shift in subtle but important ways, not through a single transformative event, but through a gradual accumulation of changes that have altered how different parts of the system relate to one another, thereby affecting the overall coherence that once made centralized influence possible. If we look at contemporary global developments through this lens, we begin to see that the issue is not that the United States has suddenly lost its capabilities or ceased to be influential, but rather that the environment in which that influence is exercised has become more complex, less aligned, and increasingly resistant to being organized around a single center. This creates a situation in which control becomes more difficult to maintain, not because it has been directly taken away, but because the conditions that previously enabled it are no longer as stable or as widely shared as they once were. In this sense, what we are observing is not a dramatic decline, but a gradual transformation, where the appearance of continuity can obscure deeper structural changes that are reshaping how power actually functions beneath the surface. And this leads to a more fundamental question, which is not simply whether one country is becoming weaker or another stronger, but whether the very idea of centralized control remains applicable in a system that is becoming increasingly decentralized, interconnected, and dynamic. If we try to understand what is actually changing in the global system, it becomes necessary to move beyond the familiar narrative of individual countries rising or declining, and instead focus on the deeper structural transformation that is quietly reshaping how power itself is organized and exercised. In earlier periods, global power functioned in a relatively centralized manner where influence was concentrated within a limited number of institutions, alliances, and economic systems that were largely aligned with one another, creating a kind of coherence that made coordination not only possible, but often predictable. Within this structure, even disagreements between states tended to occur inside a shared framework, meaning that while conflict existed, it was still constrained by a broader system that most actors recognized and operated within. However, over time, this coherence has gradually weakened, not through a single dramatic event, but through a series of incremental changes that, when taken together, have begun to alter the fundamental nature of the system. One of the most significant of these changes has been the emergence of alternative networks of influence, particularly in the economic and strategic domains, where countries are no longer relying exclusively on traditional institutions, but are instead participating in parallel arrangements that provide new options and new forms of connectivity. China's role in this process is often highlighted, But what is important is not simply China's rise as a powerful state, but the method through which it has expanded its influence, which has largely involved building systems that operate alongside existing structures rather than directly replacing them. Through initiatives related to infrastructure, trade, and finance, it has contributed to the creation of an environment in which countries are able to engage in multiple overlapping networks, thereby reducing their dependence on any single center of power. As these alternatives become more viable, the concept of alignment itself begins to shift because countries are no longer required to position themselves firmly within one bloc or another, but can instead navigate between different systems based on their immediate interests and long-term strategies. This flexibility, while advantageous for individual states, introduces a level of complexity into the global system that makes centralized coordination significantly more difficult. At the same time, regional powers have increasingly asserted their autonomy in ways that reflect a broader change in strategic thinking as they seek to balance relationships rather than commit to fixed alliances and to maintain room for maneuver rather than accept constraints imposed by larger powers. This does not necessarily indicate opposition, but it does signal a move toward a more independent and context-driven approach to international relations. If we examine this pattern more closely, it becomes clear that power is no longer concentrated within a single hierarchical structure, but is instead distributed across multiple layers that interact in dynamic and often unpredictable ways. Economic influence, for instance, is no longer tied exclusively to one dominant system, but is spread across various networks that coexist and sometimes compete with one another, while military influence has become more regionally defined, and technological leadership is increasingly shared among several major actors rather than monopolized by one. This diffusion of power creates a fundamentally different environment, one in which influence cannot be assumed or imposed in the same way as before, but must instead be negotiated continuously across a range of actors with differing priorities and perspectives. As a result, the ability of any single country to shape outcomes consistently becomes more limited, not necessarily because its capabilities have diminished, but because the system itself no longer supports the same degree of centralized control. Perhaps the most significant shift, however, is not structural but behavioral, as countries begin to think differently about their place within the global system, placing greater emphasis on flexibility, resilience, and strategic autonomy. This change in mindset alters the way decisions are made as states become less willing to rely on fixed alignments and more inclined to adapt their positions based on changing circumstances. In such an environment, power becomes less about commanding outcomes and more about influencing processes, less about control and more about navigation, and less about dominance and more about the ability to operate effectively within a complex and evolving system. What this suggests is that the nature of global power is not simply shifting from one country to another, but is being redefined in a way that makes traditional concepts of control increasingly difficult to sustain. And if we connect this back to your broader framework, as emphasized here, political developments should not be viewed as isolated incidents, but as part of larger patterns that unfold over time, reflecting deeper structural changes that are not always immediately visible but ultimately shape the direction of the system itself. If we step back from individual events and consider the broader trajectory of these changes, it becomes clear that what is unfolding is not merely a redistribution of power among states, but a deeper transformation in the way power itself is structured, exercised, and understood within the global system. In a more centralized order, stability often emerged from the presence of a dominant actor that was capable of setting rules, enforcing norms, and maintaining a degree of predictability in how conflicts and cooperation would unfold, thereby creating a framework within which other states could operate with a relatively clear sense of boundaries and expectations. However, as power becomes more distributed across multiple actors and overlapping systems, the nature of stability begins to change, because it can no longer rely on a single source of authority, but must instead emerge from the interaction of many different forces, each with its own interests, priorities, and strategic calculations. This shift introduces a level of complexity that makes outcomes inherently less predictable. As coordination becomes more difficult and the potential for misalignment increases, particularly in situations where different actors interpret the same developments in different ways or pursue objectives that do not easily converge. At the same time, this does not necessarily lead to instability in a simple or linear sense, because a more distributed system can also be more adaptable, allowing for multiple forms of balance to emerge rather than depending on a single dominant structure to maintain order. What this suggests is that the concept of control, as it has traditionally been applied to global power, may be becoming less relevant, not because influence has disappeared, but because it is now exercised in a more diffuse and negotiated manner that does not lend itself to centralized direction. In this context, the question is no longer whether the United States or any other country can maintain control in the way that might have been possible in the past, but rather how states can operate effectively within a system where influence is contingent, relationships are fluid, and outcomes are shaped by a constantly shifting set of interactions. This reframing changes how we interpret global developments because it encourages us to move away from viewing events as isolated incidents or as indicators of simple rise and decline, and instead to see them as expressions of a broader structural transition that is redefining the parameters of power itself. As reflected in your guiding framework, political developments are best understood not as standalone moments, but as part of larger patterns that unfold gradually, revealing deeper shifts that are not always immediately visible, but ultimately shape the direction of the system over time. And if we take this perspective seriously, then the more important question is not whether global power is being lost, but how it is being reorganized, and what this reorganization means for the future of strategy, cooperation, and conflict in a world where no single actor can fully determine the outcome. This leaves us with an open and perhaps more challenging question, which is how countries should think about influence in a system where control is no longer centralized, and whether new forms of coordination can emerge that reflect the realities of a more distributed and interconnected global order.